Hey all, we are at the top of the hour. Welcome to the December 2021 all remote group conversation. I'm excited for this one. A lot has happened since the last time we did one of these. Just a few things like becoming the world's first all remote company to go public and the first to publicly live stream its listing day from NASDAQ. Major kudos to Jessica Reeder for driving a huge amount of that. So I'm excited to jump in. The slides are linked from the agenda document, and it looks like Jim has the first question. Thanks for teeing that up, Jim.
Sure. And Darren, I have to say at the IPO, it looked like you were the professional broadcaster during that interview, not the other way around. So you did a great job. So I'm curious with slide 10, you know, the discussion around doing weekly asyncs, but it wasn't clear to me kind of what's the driver behind that. So I put some things into the doc. I had some ideas what it might be, you know, as an experiment, see how far we can take async, right? Is it a productivity objective? Is it to do deeper work on big block projects, for example, or something else? So it's just kind of curious, as you went into that, what was the team hoping to achieve with async weeks?
Thanks for that question, Jim. I'm going to link our handbook page to async weeks there in the document. This idea was incepted and executed by Jessica on my team. So I'd love to turn it over for her. And then if Betsy, if you want to add anything, I can add something as well after Jessica.
Sure. Great question, Jim. And it made me think a little bit. I had to think back to what were we thinking when we started this all the way back in January 2021. And I think that at the root of it, for me, there are a lot of elements to our work that are a little bit theoretical. So we believe this is going to work. We believe it's a good idea, but it's good for us to test it as well. And so the first thing that I sort of had in mind was, let's put this to the test. We talk a lot about async. We try to do it, but we don't necessarily formalize it yet. And so how about we try formalizing it in a program that we do once every 6 weeks for 1 week? And so Darren was super supportive and receptive. And in fact, this sort of came out of a brainstorm that we were having at the time. So it's not all me. We definitely came up with that collaboratively. And I think, yeah, a lot of these points that you're asking, the answer is yes. Certainly we wanted to improve productivity. We were both in a place, and Darren can probably speak to this, but Darren was having interviews back to back to back, and our calendars were getting really full of meetings and calls and everything. And it was like, we talk about async, but we're so busy and we can't get any time to think. So I think we decided to create this forcing function to really put into place these practices that we were expounding on, that we thought were a great idea, and just to see if we could really pull it off. So yes, to see how far we could take the boundaries of async work, yes. To improve productivity, yes. What metrics were used to measure that? Actually, we didn't really measure, I would say, productivity. I think we just believed it would happen. So that's a great iteration we can do for next year. And to have uninterrupted blocks of time, 100%. I would say above all, that was our main goal so that we could focus and get some creative work done. Darren, anything you want to add on that, or Betsy?
I'll add on the metrics, a bit of a softer metric. It seemed like every async week we would mention it, either the team meeting before or after, like, hey, we've got an async week coming up. And there was always this surge of excitement. Like I would go into our calendar invites and I would change our one-on-ones to have async parenthetically after that. I would keep the calendar invite so it would remind me to jump into my one-on-one documents and contribute to the items that were listed in there, but we did it asynchronously. And I think the soft metric was we always felt more refreshed going into them and coming out of them. For me, a few unintended but fantastic outcomes on the marketing and awareness side is we saw other teams inside and outside of GitLab pay attention to this, if not full on implement it and embrace it. If you look at the handbook link, the growth team, for example, tried this, put together their own retrospective. Not all of the feedback was positive, but it was all useful. which is really helpful. And other organizations around the world adopted similar incarnations of this. Twitter actually implemented focus weeks, for example, and a lot of that was due to our evangelizing this, and then companies looking at GitLab as the pioneer of remote work. They appreciate what we're doing. They think it's interesting. There's value there because we've proven this for so long. So we started somewhat of a movement inside and outside of GitLab. So it's been awesome to watch that and see the success that, or at least the change in mental model that it has encouraged inside and outside of GitLab. Betsy, anything else to add there?
I will give a big +1 to the excitement that we feel when we're leading into it. I think it's just one of those things that you sort of look forward to as a time that you have that uninterrupted focus time throughout the week. And I think it's also, we've talked a little bit about how it's different for each team. So that's something kind of, important to keep in mind, is how that looks for your team may be different than how it looks for our team. So figuring out sort of what your iteration of async week can be helpful too.
I'll add one more thing here, that it really helped us practice what we put forth in terms of really being rigorous around documentation. If you have this continual drumbeat of every 6 weeks, you know that this entire week, for the most part, there's some external meetings and things like that, but for the most part, it's going to be async, then it keeps you accountable to be a great documentarian in the 5 weeks between them. Because if you're only great at documenting 1 week out of every 6, you're not going to have the best documentation to scale your knowledge and scale your team. But if you know that that week is going to be full on documentation, it keeps you accountable in the 5 weeks in between to continue being great at it. And if you struggle with that, this could be an ideal forcing function to get better at that and improve on that.
Especially for one-on-ones, I've found that particularly good as a forcing function, because we're better than at giving more context in our one-on-one documents, even if we're going to be discussing it live, because we're used to also doing that asynchronously. It helps tremendously for looking back at things for reference in the future.
Oddly, as a manager, I feel like our most productive, work-related productive one-on-ones are the async weeks, because the documentation is so rigorous and we tag each other back and forth, and it's just so focused on getting work done. And then I'm really thankful for the synchronous one-on-ones, because that is really beneficial for rapport building. And so you kind of need that balance. If it was all work all the time, eventually the culture would decay. But it is fascinating that I feel like the async weeks make us more productive on the work front. If you can't tell, we love this stuff. I'll toss it back to Jim if he has any follow-ups there.
So just a comment on the follow-up. The handbook talks about some groups may not be as practical, customer-facing groups, like I'm in the sales organization. So I agree with that. However, Focus Friday, all the things you were describing that gave you joy, that's Focus Friday for the field. So whatever we need to do to keep Focus Friday, I'm going to vote hard for that. My second question is with respect, I joined the company at the time. We had a lot of ways to build human connection, contribute. We had stipends to go travel to other places. And I was recently talking with my leadership that, a lot of the folks that have joined in the last 18 months, they haven't seen that ability to create those connections. So I was interested if you all have seen some ways to build that kind of connection where we're 100% remote 100% of the time. And I think you dropped some notes in, so I'll let you comment on those.
So here's a wild piece of trivia. On our team, Betsy is the only one who's ever been to a contribute. How crazy is that? So I joined just after the last one, and Jessica joined our team right when the pandemic was bearing down. And so we have felt the brunt of that as well. So I added a few notes here. You mentioned Zoom happy hours in particular, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I added something in the informal communication guide, mostly as a suggestion for the outside world, because what I've seen is that companies outside of GitLab, those who've transitioned to remote work, are struggling with this even more so. And they're relying on Zoom happy hours because it's the only thing they can think of. And after the third or fourth one, the effectiveness of it drops significantly. So I added a replacement called a community impact outing, with the goal being, if a leader is going to already kind of commit those hours to getting people together, try deploying those people into their communities around the world. Maybe ask them to wear company swag and take a selfie while they're there. Maybe at Habitat for Humanity, reading in a local library, donating time at a food bank. And if everybody's wearing company swag while they're engaged in this hour, then you have a mechanism for sharing those photos, videos, and stories back on, hey, here's what we did with our quote unquote Zoom happy hour. And it actually lends nicely to asynchronous, because with time zones all over the world, you could take that hour, let's say anytime during the week, and it creates this kind of shared bonding experience that's distributed, like a distributed shared experience. So I tossed that out there as a boring solution for groups to try. That's a pretty fresh addition. I'm excited to see if folks share that and try that. For me personally, coffee chats have taken on greater importance during this time. It isn't a complete replacement for IRL. We're humans. We're relational, communal beings. I love seeing people. I was blessed to be able to travel to New York for listing day. And I can't tell you how amazing it was to see people in real life. So I don't think there's a perfect replacement, but coffee chats are really important. And the last thing here, I've gotten a lot of joy from sharing photos and videos of life outside of work. If you look in the Corp Comms channel, yes, thanks, Brad. IRL is in real life, in the Earthverse, as it were, as in the opposite of the metaverse with all the carbon and stuff. If you look at the Corp Comms channel and our All Remote Actions channel, you'll see that we have a GeekBot plugin, which is an automated way to do an asynchronous stand-up every week. And we can share photos of what we did over the weekend or what we did last week. And it's amazing to see glimpses of people's lives. Family and Friends channel is another great one on this, where people share what they're doing outside of work. So if you're a manager, encourage your team, if they feel comfortable, to share more of that. We recently started doing this in our All Remote channel after seeing the Corp Comms team do this for a really long time. And I've been really impressed with kind of the genuineness and the authenticity that it's added. Betsy, I see you added a +1 to that.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. I think when we talked about starting it for our team, it was like we occasionally would have these longer stretches where we weren't able to get together synchronously. And when we did, we wanted to, stick to an agenda, and maybe didn't have time to go in as detailed or share photos or things like that you get to do in something like a stand-up bot in Slack. So I think sometimes we assume that something like that is impersonal, but it actually gives you a chance to really go into detail about things in your life that may not come up otherwise. And then it helps not only just get to know each other, but have, more empathy for what's going on in that person's life that week, for example. So it's a relationship building thing, but it also helps you work better together in the end.
Awesome. Thanks. Those are great ideas. Appreciate it.
Jessica, do you want to verbalize point D there?
Yeah, I had written in a little bit as well. I would say, I don't have experience of what it was like pre-pandemic. I started on March 3rd, 2020. So I've been working at GitLab for one pandemic. But I will say that since I started, it has seemed that we've gotten better at connecting async. There's a lot of stuff happening on Slack that I think is more effective now. I think, excuse me, people are using, all sorts of different ways, channels, conversations to connect to each other. Things are happening like the Crucial Conversations. L&D is doing an amazing job of creating these programs that are helping people understand how to talk to each other, that are really enforcing better ways for us to act and connect and be people towards each other. So definitely look into those programs as well. And then I just want to shout out a little bit our team donation drive, because this is the second year that we've done it. And the results are extraordinary. There are 116 people who have donated, what did I write? $266,000 and 575 volunteer hours just since November. Things like that are ways for us to get together and do something together, even if it's totally async, totally distributed. It helps us feel like we're part of a team and we're doing something different. So I think things like that are effective. It'll be great when we can see each other again, but in the meantime, there are ways we can connect and work together.
Great idea. Thanks.
Barker, you have the next question. Do you want to verbalize?
Yeah, I'll verbalize. I've been experiencing an increase in direct Slack DMs for urgent work leading up to going public, because it's super exciting and there's a lot to get done, and more since we've gone public. So I'd like to hear how you use Slack to work remotely and how we can build good habits as we grow.
Are you actually in a parking lot, or is that a virtual backup?
Oh, and we lost her.
Oh no. That is, I'm going to be waiting on pins and needles for the answer to that. Barker's always somewhere amazing. Jessica, you have the first point here. I'll let you go.
Yeah, totally. And thankfully, I wrote it down so she can read the answer later. But oh, there she is. Okay, so we were talking about this. Darren and Betsy and I were talking about this. We were saying, leading up to the IPO, we're seeing this happening. All of these like urgent work. It's got to happen right now. And we were really concerned. What's going to happen after IPO? Are people going to remember to go back to the workflows that we established previously, or are we going to get into this kind of a dynamic? So it's not at all surprising to hear that. And I think a lot of us are sort of experiencing that. And what we need to do is start reinforcing the right workflows again, the way that we really want to work as GitLab. And we all sort of need to remind each other, because that was an extraordinary thing that we went through. And hopefully that kind of work is in the past for us now. So I really appreciate a shout out to the marketing ops team and their channel, because right in the description of the channel, it says, if it's not an issue, it's not our issue. And that is very important. Every time I go to that channel and try to ask a question, I see that. And I remember, oh, they're not going to respond if I don't have an issue to link to. So I create the issue. And I think little nudges like that are going to be really important. So think about how you can nudge people back into the workflows that you want. Work with your manager on how you're going to triage things that you can't get into the right workflow. And hopefully with some systematic thinking, it'll get a little bit better.
Yeah. I actually petitioned for like a public celebration day of mass deletion of private channels after the IPO, just to celebrate those locked channels going away. One other tip I'll share here is, if I get a DM, I will directly ask people to port that conversation to a public channel or issue or merge request, unless it is specifically confidential or they are specifically uncomfortable with it. But at the very least, it brings up the conversation where I can link to a handbook section that says, this is how we work at GitLab. We try to work in public spaces as much as we can, because it fosters greater diversity of thought, because it allows everyone to contribute. And we need to reinforce that. So if you're in a position, I think anyone can play a role here, but especially in management, reinforce this, remind people of this. The chief of staff team actually looks at a metric of how many messages in terms of a percentage ratio are sent as a DM versus in a public channel. And I appreciate that we look at that, and we all have to play a role in getting that ratio back towards more public conversation. But I would say, don't be bashful in asking folks to put things in a public channel, because if you think about the hundreds of people that have joined during that pocket of time where we were having to do all of this for an extraordinary time, they may think that is the way, but in fact that is not the way, and they're not going to know that unless people lead differently. And it's on all of us to do that. Barker, I still want to know if that's a real parking lot you're in.
Yeah, it's the back of the coffee shop because it was loud and there's music. So I came out here and I hit that red leave button instead of the unmute button.
I like that we made you laugh so hard you laughed out of the call. That's
yeah.
I'm good ending 2021 on that. Thank you, Lauren. You're an amazing bottle of energy. That is much appreciated. That's actually the last question we have, but if anybody wants to verbalize one, we've got a few more minutes here. We're happy to answer more.
I gotta follow up to that point, Darren and Jessica, about the urgent, because I'm feeling that too. How do you do that? How do you like remind folks when they're much more senior than you, though? Because I'm seeing VPs and senior directors doing those behaviors, and it's kind of intimidating, to say, hey, send this in a public channel or whatnot. And we've tried to remind folks. I think L&D, that's one of our roles, is to reinforce those values, and we've gotten a little bit of pushback from folks on just coming across as like, hey, like, why are you policing me? kind of. So I'm just curious if you have any tips or strategies there. Good to see everyone too.
Yeah, good stuff. I'll give you my perspective. Maybe Jessica has some. I think we just got to do it. I think we just got to do it. This is the GitLab way. It's documented this way. And if it's in the handbook, that's the way it is until the handbook changes. And the handbook even says that. And so for me, it's being kind in all of this, but also being direct. And this is what is documented. This is the workflow. If this needs to change, there's a process for how it needs to change. That's the only way that it's going to hold up over time. Otherwise, if you look at our values page, there's the dysfunctions that you'll see there. Otherwise, that's immediately where it will go.
I feel like there's also something to be said for sort of taking the lead and doing it, like kind of leading by example there of if you're having a DM conversation about something that you recognize should and could be talked about in an issue or in a public channel, just saying like, hey, great idea. I'm actually going to continue this conversation here. And then just kind of starting it that way. So you're not making yourself as uncomfortable by directly having to sort of outwardly coach someone that's more senior than you, but you are leading by example and getting us back on track with how we should be working together.
That is so good, Betsy. So in that case, you're essentially going out of your way to create the issue or the merge request so that the conversation can happen there. But if that's what's necessary versus throwing it back, like, hey, you create the issue, it's probably still worthwhile. And it's also a learning experience because for some people, maybe that just hasn't been their MO. And so seeing people be guided through it can be really helpful. I love that. Thanks, Betsy.
This is a really interesting question too. And I see that, yes, the most direct way to resolve this is to take the individual initiative. But if it's a trend and it's happening throughout the team, then we need to also think systematically, right? So maybe this is raising an opportunity and a need for, some training. Maybe it's a conversation that we need to have as an entire organization without calling out specific people. Maybe we just all need to go back and revisit our documentation and communication practices. So maybe that's an area of focus, maybe something we can support in the upcoming year.
Josh, one of the things that I have advised companies that have suddenly transitioned to remote is this concept of reboarding. Going as far as literally re-onboarding the entire company on how to do things remote first. Because for some of these companies, it is that new. It doesn't matter if you've been there 20 years, it's like you've joined a new company. And maybe there's something there for us. Every year we do an annual reboarding on certain things. That could be fun.
Yeah, I love that idea. We move so fast here. I will say too, I'll post in the chat, but we've got some Slack training coming out with an L&D if anybody wants to participate in January.
I was just about to say that the Slack training is like the perfect example of that even those of us who have been here for a while, it's a great kind of reminder and retraining for all of us.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Betsy.
2 minutes left in the allotted time. Anyone have a last question they want to verbalize? Thanks all for joining today. This was fun as always. If you have any other questions, meet us in the remote or all remote action channel. We'll be happy to continue the conversation there.